I think we could. Okay, let's get on with it. Let's do it. Okay. So, starting at book the second, chapter 16, Still Knitting. Still Knitting. Madame Defarge and Monsieur her husband returned amicably to the bosom of Saint Antoine, while a speck in a blue cap toiled through the darkness and through the dust and down the weary miles of avenue by the wayside, slowly tending towards that point of the compass where the chateau of Monsieur the Marquis, now in his grave, listened to the whispering trees. Oh, that's right, because Monsieur the Marquis got murdered. He got murdered on the same day that his estranged nephew, Charles Darnay, came to visit. Someone's been arrested for the murder, but they haven't identified it yet. Such ample leisure had the stone faces now for listening to the trees and to the fountain, that the few village scarecrows, who in their quest for herbs to eat and fragments of dead stick to burn, strayed within sight of the great stone courtyard and terrace staircase, had it borne in upon their starved fancy that the expression of the faces was altered. A rumour just lived in the village, had a faint and bare existence there, as its people had, that when the knife struck home, the faces changed from faces of pride to faces of anger and pain. Also that when that dangling figure was hauled up 40 feet above the fountain, they changed again, and bore a cruel look of being avenged, which they would henceforth bear forever. In the stone face, over the great window of the bedchamber, where the murder was done, 2 fine dints were pointed out in the sculptured nose, which everybody recognized, and which nobody had seen of old. And on the scarce occasions when 2 or 3 ragged peasants emerged from the crowd to take a hurried peep at Monsieur the Marquis petrified, a skinny finger would not have pointed to it for a minute before they all started away among the moss and leaves, like the more fortunate hares who could find a living there. Chateau and hut, stone face and dangling figure, the red stain on the stone floor, and the pure water in the village well, thousands of acres of land, a whole province of France, all France itself, lay under the night sky, concentrated into a faint hair-breadth line. So does a whole world, with all its greatnesses and littlenesses, lie in a twinkling star. And as mere human knowledge can split a ray of light and analyze the manner of its composition, so sublimer intelligences may read, in the feeble shining of this earth of ours, every thought and act, every vice and virtue of every responsible creature on it. The Defarges, husband and wife, came lumbering under the starlight in their public vehicle to that gate of Paris whereunto their journey naturally tended. There was the usual stoppage at the barrier guard-house, and the usual lanterns came glancing forth for the usual examination and inquiry. Monsieur Defarge alighted, knowing 1 or 2 of the soldiery there, and 1 of the police. The latter he was intimate with, and affectionately embraced. When Saint Antoine had again enfolded the Defarges in his dusky wings, and they, having finally alighted near the saint's boundaries, were picking their way on foot through the black mud and offal of his streets, Madame Defarge spoke to her husband. "Say then, my friend, what did Jacques of the police tell thee?" "Well, even the police are in on this underground thing, if this Jacques naming business is still applicable here." Very little tonight, but all he knows. There is another spy commissioned for our court. There may be many more, for all that he can say, but he knows of one." "Well," said Madame Defarge, raising her eyebrows with a cool business air, "it is necessary to register him. How do they call that man?" "He is English." "So much the better. His name?" "Barsad," said Defarge, making it French by pronunciation. But he had been so careful to get it accurately that he then spelt it with perfect correctness. "Barsad," repeated Madame. "Good. A Christian name?" "John." "John Barsad," repeated Madame, after murmuring it once to herself. "Good. His appearance, is it known?" "Good morning, Lightning. Good morning, sir." "Age, about 40 years. Height, about 5 feet 9. Black hair. Complexion dark. Generally rather handsome visage. Eyes dark. Face thin, long, and sallow. Nose aquiline, but not straight, having a peculiar inclination towards the left cheek. Expression, therefore, sinister." "My faith, it is a portrait," said Madame, laughing. "He shall be registered tomorrow." They turned into the wine-shop, which was closed, for it was midnight, and where Madame Defarge immediately took her post at her desk, counted the small moneys that had been taken during her absence, examined the stock, went through the entries in the book, made other entries of her own, checked the serving-man in every possible way, and finally dismissed him to bed. Then she turned out the contents of the bowl of money for the second time, and began knotting them up in her handkerchief in a chain of separate knots for safe keeping through the night. All this while Defarge, with his pipe in his mouth, walked up and down, complacently admiring, but never interfering. In which condition, indeed, as to the business and his domestic affairs, he walked up and down through life. The night was hot, and the shop, close shut and surrounded by so foul a neighbourhood, was ill-smelling. Monsieur Defarge's olfactory sense was by no means delicate, but the stock of wine smelt much stronger than it ever tasted, and so did the stock of rum and brandy and aniseed. He whiffed the compound of scents away as he put down his smoked-out pipe. "You are fatigued," said Madame, raising her glance as she knotted the money. "There are only the usual odours." "I am a little tired," her husband acknowledged. "You are a little depressed, too," said Madame, whose quick eyes had never been so intent on the accounts, but they had had a ray or two for him. "Oh, the men, the men!" "Oh, but my dear," began Defarge. "But my dear," repeated Madame, nodding firmly. "But my dear, you are faint of heart tonight, my dear." "Well, then," said Defarge, as if a thought were wrung out of his breast, "it is a long time." "It is a long time," repeated his wife, "and when is it not a long time? Vengeance and retribution require a long time. It is the rule." "It does not take a long time to strike a man with lightning," said Defarge. "How long," demanded Madame composedly, "does it take to make and store the lightning? Tell me." Defarge raised his head thoughtfully, as if there were something in that too. "It does not take a long time," said Madame, "for an earthquake to swallow a town. Well, tell me how long it takes to prepare the earthquake." "A long time, I suppose." "But when it is ready, it takes place and grinds to pieces everything before it. In the meantime it is always preparing, though it is not seen or heard. That is your consolation. Keep it, She tied a knot with flashing eyes, as if it throttled a foe. "I tell thee," said Madame, extending her right hand for emphasis, "that although it is a long time on the road, it is on the road and coming. I tell thee it never retreats and never stops. I tell thee it is always advancing. Look around and consider the lives of all the world that we know. Consider the faces of all the world that we know. Consider the rage and discontent to which the Jacquerie addresses itself with more and more of certainty every hour. Can such things last? Bah, I mock you." "My brave wife," returned Defarge, standing before her, with his head a little bent, and his hands clasped at his back, like a docile and attentive pupil before his catechist. "I do not question all this, but it has lasted a long time, and it is possible, you know well, my wife, it is possible, that it may not come during our lives." Well, how then?" demanded Madame, tying another knot, as if there were another enemy strangled. "Well," said Defarge, with a half-complaining and half-apologetic shrug, "we shall not see the triumph." "We shall have helped it," returned Madame, with her extended hand in strong action. "Nothing that we do is done in vain. I believe, with all my soul, that we shall see the triumph. But even if not, even if I knew, certainly not, show me the neck of an aristocrat and tyrant, and still I would—" Then Madame, with her teeth set, tied a very terrible knot indeed. "Hold!" cried Defarge, reddening a little, as if he felt charged with cowardice. "I, too, my dear, will stop at nothing." "Yes, but it is your weakness that you sometimes need to see your victim and your opportunity to sustain you. Sustain yourself without that. When the time comes, let loose a tiger and a devil, but wait for the time with the tiger and the devil chained, not shorn, yet always ready." Madame enforced the conclusion of this piece of advice by striking her little counter with her chain of money as if she knocked its brains out, and then gathering the heavy handkerchief under her arm in a serene manner, and observing that it was time to go to bed. Next noontide saw the admirable woman in her usual place in the wine-shop, knitting away assiduously. A rose lay beside her, and if she now and then glanced at the flower, it was with no infraction of her usual preoccupied air. There were a few customers, drinking or not drinking, standing or seated, sprinkled about. The day was very hot, and heaps of flies, who were extending their inquisitive and adventurous perquisitions into all the glutinous little glasses near Madame, fell dead at the bottom. Their decease made no impression on the other flies out promenading, who looked at them in the coolest manner, as if they themselves were elephants or something as far removed, until they met the same fate. Curious to consider how heedless flies are, perhaps they thought as much at court that sunny summer day. A figure entering at the door threw a shadow on Madame Defarge, which she felt to be a new one. She laid down her knitting and began to pin her rose in her head-dress before she looked at the figure. It was curious. The moment Madame Defarge took up the rose, the customers ceased talking and began gradually to drop out of the wine-shop. "Good day, madame," said the newcomer. "A good day, monsieur." She said it aloud, but added to herself as she resumed her knitting, "Ah, good day. Age about 40, height about 5'9", black hair, generally rather handsome visage, complexion dark, eyes dark, thin, long, and sallow face, aquiline nose but not straight, having a peculiar inclination towards the left cheek which imparts a sinister expression. Good day, one and all. Have the goodness to give me a little glass of old cognac and a mouthful of cool French water, madame." Madame complied with a polite air. "Marvelous cognac, this, madame." It was the first time it had ever been so complimented, and Madame Defarge knew enough of its antecedents to know better. She said, however, that the cognac was flattered, and took up her knitting. The visitor watched her fingers for a few moments, and took the opportunity of observing the place in general. "You knit with great skill, madame." "I am accustomed to it." "A pretty pattern, too." "You think so?" said madame, looking at him with a smile. "Decidedly. May one ask what it is for?" "A pastime," said madame, still looking at him with a smile, while her fingers moved nimbly. "Not for use?" "That depends. I may find a use for it one day. If I do, well," said madame, drawing a breath and nodding her head with a stern kind of coquetry, "I'll use it." It was remarkable, but the taste of Saint Antoine seemed to be decidedly opposed to a rose on the head-dress of Madame Defarge. Two men had entered separately, and had been about to order drink, when, catching sight of that novelty, they faltered, made a pretence of looking about as if for some friend who was not there, and went away. Nor of those who had been there when this visitor entered was there one left. They had all dropped off. The spy had kept his eyes open, but had been able to detect no sign. They had lounged away in a poverty-stricken, purposeless, accidental manner, quite natural and unimpeachable. "John," thought madame, checking off her work as her fingers knitted, and her eyes looked at the stranger. "Stay long enough, and I shall knit Bassard before you go." "You have a husband, madame?" "I have." "Children?" "No children." "Business seems bad." "Business is very bad. The people are so poor." "Ah, the unfortunate, miserable people. So oppressed, too, as you say." "As you say," madame retorted, correcting him, and deftly knitting an extra something into his name that boded him no good. "Pardon me, certainly it was I who said so, but you naturally think so, of course." "I think," returned madame in a high voice, "I and my husband have enough to do to keep this wine-shop open without thinking. All we think here is how to live. That is the subject we think of, and it gives us from morning to night enough to think about, without embarrassing our heads concerning others. I think for others? No, no." The spy, who was there to pick up any crumbs he could find or make, did not allow his baffled state to express itself in his sinister face, but stood with an air of gossiping gallantry, leaning his elbow on Madame Defarge's little counter, and occasionally sipping his cognac. "A bad business this, madame, of Gaspard's execution. Ah, the poor Gaspard!" with a sigh of great compassion. "My faith," returned madame coolly and lightly, "if people use knives for such purposes, they have to pay for it. He knew beforehand what the price of his luxury was. He has paid the price." "I believe," said the spy, dropping his soft voice to a tone that invited confidence, and expressing an injured revolutionary susceptibility in every muscle of his wicked face, I believe there is much compassion and anger in this neighborhood touching the poor fellow. Between ourselves." "Is there?" asked Madame vacantly. "Is there not?" "Here is my husband," said Madame Defarge. As the keeper of the wine shop entered at the door, the spy saluted him by touching his hat, and saying with an engaging smile, "Good day, Jacques." Defarge stopped short and stared at him. "Good day, Jacques," the spy repeated, with not quite so much confidence or quite so easy a smile under the stare. "You deceive yourself, monsieur," returned the keeper of the wine shop. Wrong voice. "You deceive yourself, monsieur," returned the keeper of the wine shop. "You mistake me for another. That is not my name. I am Ernest Defarge." "It is all the same," said the spy airily, but discomfited too. "Good day." "Good day," answered Defarge dryly. "I was saying to Madame, with whom I had the pleasure of chatting when you entered, that they tell me there is, and no wonder, much sympathy and anger in Saint Antoine, touching the unhappy fate of poor Gaspard." "No one has told me so," said Defarge. "No one has told me so," said Defarge, shaking his head. "I know nothing of it." Having said it, he passed behind the little counter, and stood with his hand on the back of his wife's chair, looking over that barrier at the person to whom they were both opposed, and whom either of them would have shot with the greatest satisfaction. The spy, well used to his business, did not change his unconscious attitude, but drained his little glass of cognac, took a sip of fresh water, and asked for another glass of cognac. Madame Defarge poured it out for him, took to her knitting again, and hummed a little song over it. "You seem to know this quarter well, that is to say, better than I do," observed Defarge. "Not at all, but I hope to know it better. I am so profoundly interested in its miserable inhabitants." "Huh," muttered Defarge. "The pleasure of conversing with you, Monsieur Defarge, recalls to me," pursued the spy, "that I have the honor of cherishing some interesting associations with your name." "Indeed," said Defarge with much indifference. "Yes, indeed. When Dr. Manette was released, you, his old domestic—" "Oh, that's a bit of new information there. Okay. When Dr. Manette was released, you, his old domestic, had the charge of him, I know. He was delivered to you. You see, I am informed of the circumstances." "Such is the fact, certainly," said Defarge. He had had it conveyed to him, in an accidental touch of his wife's elbow, as she knitted and warbled, that he would do best to answer, but always with brevity. "It was to you," said the spy, "that his daughter came, and it was from your care that his daughter took him, accompanied by a neat brown monsieur, how is he called, in a little wig, Lorry, of the Bank of Tellson and Company, over to England." "Such is the fact," repeated Defarge. "Very interesting remembrances," said the spy. "I have known Dr. Manette and his daughter in England." "Yes," said Defarge. "You don't hear much about them now?" said the spy. No. In effect, Madame struck in, looking up from her work and her little song, we never hear about them. We received the news of their safe arrival and perhaps another letter, or perhaps two. But since then they have gradually taken their road in life, we ours, and we have held no correspondence. Perfectly so, madame, replied the spy. She is going to be married. Going, echoed madame. She was pretty enough to have been married long ago. You English are cold, it seems to me. Oh, you know I am English. I perceive your tongue is, returned madame, and what the tongue is, I suppose the man is. He did not take the identification as a compliment, but he made the best of it, and turned it off with a laugh. After sipping his cognac to the end, he added, Yes, Manette, Miss Manette is going to be married, but not to an Englishman, to one who, like herself, is French by birth. And speaking of Gaspard, poor Gaspard, it was cruel, cruel. It is a curious thing that she is going to marry the nephew of Monsieur the Marquis, for whom Gaspard was exalted to that height of so many feet. In other words, the present Marquis. But he lives unknown in England. He is no Marquis there. He is Mr. Charles Darnay. D'Aulnay is the name of his mother's family. Madame Defarge knitted steadily, but the intelligence had a palpable effect upon her husband. Do what he could behind the little counter as to the striking of a light and the lighting of his pipe, he was troubled, and his hand was not trustworthy. The spy would have been no spy if he had failed to see it or to record it in his mind. Having made, at least, this one hit, whatever it might prove to be worth, and no customers coming in to help him to any other, Mr. Barsad paid for what he had drunk and took his leave, taking occasion to say, in a genteel manner, before he departed, that he looked forward to the pleasure of seeing Monsieur and Madame Defarge again. For some minutes after he had emerged into the outer presence of Saint Antoine, the husband and wife remained exactly as he had left them, lest he should come back. "Can it be true?" said Defarge in a low voice, looking down at his wife as he stood smoking, with his hand on the back of her chair. "What he has said of Mademoiselle Manette?" "As he has said it," returned Madame, lifting her eyebrows a little, "it is probably false. But it may be true." "If it is," Defarge began, and stopped. "If it is," repeated his wife. "And if it does come, while we live to see it triumph, I hope, for her sake, destiny will keep her husband out of France." "Her husband's destiny," said Madame Defarge, with her usual composure, "will take him where he is to go, and will lead him to that end that is to end him. That is all I know." "But it is very strange, now at least, is it not very strange?" said Defarge, rather pleading with his wife to induce her to admit it, "that, after all our sympathy for Monsieur her father, and herself, her husband's name should be proscribed under your hand at this moment by the side of that infernal dog's who's just left us." "Stranger things than that will happen when it does come," answered Madame. "I have them both here of a certainty, and they are both here for their merits. That is enough." She rolled up her knitting when she had said those words, and presently took the rose out of the handkerchief that was wound around her head. Either Saint Antoine had an instinctive sense that the objectionable decoration was gone, or Saint Antoine was on the watch for its disappearance. Howbeit, the saint took courage to lounge in very shortly afterwards, and the wine-shop recovered its habitual aspect. In the evening, at which season of all others Saint Antoine turned himself inside out, and sat on doorsteps and window ledges, and came to the corners of vile streets and courts for a breath of air, Madame Defarge, with her work in her hand, was accustomed to pass from place to place, and from group to group. A missionary. There were many like her, such as the world will do well never to breed again. All the women knitted. They knitted worthless things, but the mechanical work was a mechanical substitute for eating and drinking. The hands moved for the jaws and the digestive apparatus. If the bony fingers had been still, the stomachs would have been more famine-pinched. But as the fingers went, the eyes went, and the thoughts. And as Madame Defarge moved on from group to group, all three went quicker and fiercer among every little knot of women that she had spoken with and left behind. Her husband smoked at his door, looking after her with admiration. "A great woman," said he, "a strong woman, a grand woman, a frightfully grand woman." Darkness closed around, and then came the ringing of church bells and the distant beating of the military drums in the palace courtyard, as the women sat knitting. Darkness encompassed them. Another darkness was closing in, as surely, when the church bells, then ringing pleasantly in many an airy steeple over France, should be melted into thundering cannon. When the military drums should be beating to drown a wretched voice, that night all potent as the voice of power and plenty, freedom and life. Well, I'm going to read that one again. When the military drums should be beating to drown a wretched voice, that night all potent as the voice of power and plenty, freedom and life. So much was closing in about the women who sat knitting, that their very selves were closely closing in around a structure yet unbuilt, where they were to sit, knitting, counting dropping heads. Man, okay, that's a interesting. One second. Interesting beginning there. Okay, so they were warned about the spy. Okay, so yeah, I guess the big takeaway from that. Okay, so the rumor going round is that Miss Manette, who is French by birth, and is getting married to Charles Darnay. But no one knows, well, I guess the spy does, that he's letting people know that Charles Darnay is the nephew of the murdered Marquis, which means that Charles Darnay is French nobility now. And very soon it's going to be a bad, bad place in France to be a French nobleman or noblewoman. Yeah. All righty. Man. Where are we at? Okay. So far, so good. Chapter 17. One night. Never did the sun go down with a brighter glory on the quiet corner in Soho than one memorable evening when the doctor and his daughter sat under the plane tree together. Never did the moon rise with a milder radiance over great London than on that night, when it found them still seated under the tree, and shone upon their faces through its leaves. Lucie was to be married tomorrow. She had reserved this last evening for her father, and they sat alone under the plane tree.
"You are happy, my dear father?"
"Oh, quite, my child." They had said little, though they had been there a long time. When it was yet light enough to work and read, she had neither engaged herself in her usual work, nor had she read to him. She had employed herself in both ways, at his side, under the tree, many and many a time. But this time was not quite like any other, and nothing could make it so.
"And I am very happy tonight, dear father. I am deeply happy in the love that heaven has so blessed, my love for Charles, and Charles' love for me. But if my life were not to be still consecrated to you, or if my marriage were so arranged as that it would part us, even by the length of a few of these streets, I should be more unhappy and self-reproachful now than I can tell you. Even as it is—"
Even as it was, she could not command her voice. In the sad moonlight she clasped him by the neck and laid her face upon his breast. In the moonlight, which is always sad, as the light of the sun itself is, as the light called human life is, at its coming and its going.
"Oh, dearest dear, can you tell me this last time that you feel quite sure no new affections of mine and no new duties of mine will ever interpose—"
Well, yeah. Oh, no, okay, boy, that's supposed to be the girl. Boy, I thought that would okay.
"Dearest dear, can you tell me this last time that you feel quite sure no new affections of mine and no new duties of mine will ever interpose between us? I know it well, but do you know it? In your own heart, do you feel quite certain?"
Her father answered with a cheerful firmness of conviction he could scarcely have assumed.
"Oh, quite sure, my darling. More than that," he added, as he tenderly kissed her. "My future is far brighter, Lucie, seen through your marriage, than it could have been, nay, than it ever was without it."
"If I could hope that, my father—"
"Believe it, love, indeed it is so. Consider how natural and plain it is, my dear, that it should be so. You, devoted and young, cannot fully appreciate the anxiety I have felt that your life should not be wasted."
She moved her hand towards his lips, but he took it in his and repeated the word.
"Wasted, my child, should not be wasted, struck aside from the natural order of things for my sake. Your unselfishness cannot entirely comprehend how much my mind has gone on this, but only ask yourself, how could my happiness be perfect while yours was incomplete?"
"If I had never seen Charles, my father, I should have been quite happy with you."
He smiled at her unconscious admission that she would have been unhappy without Charles, having seen him, and replied,
"My child, you did see him, and it is Charles. If it had not been Charles, it would have been another. Or if it had been no other, I should have been the cause, and then the dark part of my life would have cast its shadow beyond myself, and would have fallen on you."
It was the first time, except at the trial, of her ever hearing him refer to the period of his suffering. It gave her a strange and new sensation while his words were in her ears, and she remembered it long afterwards.
"See," said the doctor of Beauvais, raising his hand towards the moon, "I have looked at her from my prison window when I could not bear her light. I have looked at her when it has been such torture to me to think of her shining upon what I had lost that I've beaten my head against my prison walls. I have looked at her in a state so dun and lethargic that I have thought of nothing but the number of horizontal lines I could draw across her at the full, and the number of perpendicular lines with which I could intersect them," he added in his inward and pondering manner as he looked at the moon. "It was 20 either way, I remember, and the 20th was difficult to squeeze in." The strange thrill with which she heard him go back to that time deepened as he dwelt upon it, but there was nothing to shock her in the manner of his reference. He only seemed to contrast his present cheerfulness and felicity with the dire endurance that was over. "I have looked at her, speculating thousands of times upon the unborn child from whom I had been rent. Whether it was alive, whether it had been born alive, or the poor mother's shock had killed it, whether it was a son who would some day avenge his father. There was a time in my imprisonment when my desire for vengeance was unbearable. Whether it was a son who would never know his father's story, who might even live to weigh the possibility of his father's having disappeared of his own will and act, whether it was a daughter who would grow to be a woman." She drew closer to him and kissed his cheek and hand. "I have pictured my daughter to myself as perfectly forgetful of me, rather altogether ignorant of me and unconscious of me. I have cast up the years of her age, year after year. I have seen her married to a man who knew nothing of my fate. I have altogether perished from the remembrance of the living, and in the next generation my place was a blank."
"My father, even to hear that you had such thoughts of a daughter who never existed strikes to my heart as if I had been that child."
"You, Lucie, it is out of the consolation and restoration that you have brought to me that these remembrances arise and pass between us and the moon on this last night. What did I say just now?"
"She knew nothing of you. She cared nothing for you."
"So, but on other moonlight nights, when the sadness and the silence have touched me in a different way, have affected me with something as like a sorrowful sense of peace as any emotion that had pain for its foundations could, I have imagined her as coming to me in my cell and leading me out into the freedom beyond the fortress. I have seen her image in the moonlight often, as I see you now, except that I never held her in my arms. It stood between the little grated window and the door. But you understand that that was not the child I am speaking of."
"The figure was not the image, the fancy?"
"No, that was another thing. It stood before my disturbed sense of sight, but it never moved. The phantom that my mind pursued was another and more real child. Of her outward appearance I know no more than that she was like her mother. The other had that likeness too, as you have, but was not the same. Can you follow me, Lucie? Hardly, I think. I doubt you must have been a solitary prisoner to understand these perplexed distinctions." His collected and calm manner could not prevent her blood from running cold as he thus tried to anatomize his old condition. "In that more peaceful state I have imagined her, in the moonlight, coming to me and taking me out to show me that the home of her married life was full of her loving remembrance of her lost father. My picture was in her room, and I was in her prayers. Her life was active, cheerful, useful, but my poor history pervaded it all."
"I was that child, my father. I was not half so good, but in my love that was I."
"And she showed me her children," said the doctor of Beauvais, "and they had heard of me, and been taught to pity me. When they passed a prison of the state, they kept far from its frowning walls, and looked up at its bars, and spoke in whispers. She could never deliver me. I imagined that she always brought me back after showing me such things. But then, blessed with the relief of tears, I fell upon my knees and blessed her.
I am that child, I hope, my father. Oh, my dear, will you bless me as fervently tomorrow?
Lucie, I recall these old troubles and the reason that I have tonight for loving you better than words can tell, and thanking God for my great happiness. My thoughts, when they were wildest, never rose near the happiness that I have known with you, and that we have before us. He embraced her, solemnly commended her to heaven, and humbly thanked heaven for having bestowed her on him. By and by they went into the house. There was no one bidden to the marriage but Mr. Lorry. There was even to be no bridesmaid but the gaunt Miss Pross. The marriage was to make no change in their place of residence. They had been able to extend it by taking to themselves the upper rooms formerly belonging to the apocryphal invisible lodger, and they desired nothing more. Dr. Manette was very cheerful at the little supper. They were only 3 at the table, and Miss Pross made the 3rd. He regretted that Charles was not there, was more than half disposed to object to the loving little plot that kept him away, and drank to him affectionately. So the time came for him to bid Lucie good night, and they separated. But in the stillness of the 3rd hour of the morning, Lucie came downstairs again, and stole into his room, not free from unshaped fears beforehand. All things, however, were in their places. All was quiet, and he lay asleep, his white hair picturesque on the untroubled pillow, and his hands lying quiet on the coverlet. She put her needless candle in the shadow at a distance, crept up to his bed, and put her lips to his, then leaned over him and looked at him. Into his handsome face the bitter waters of captivity had worn, but he covered up their tracks with a determination so strong that he held the mastery of them even in his sleep. A more remarkable face, in its quiet, resolute, and guarded struggle with an unseen assailant, was not to be beheld in all the wide dominions of sleep that night. She timidly laid her hand on his dear breast, and put up a prayer that she might ever be as true to him as her love aspired to be, and as his sorrows deserved. Then she withdrew her hand, and kissed his lips once more, and went away. So the sunrise came, and the shadows of the leaves of the plane tree moved upon his face as softly as her lips had moved in praying for him. Man, I hope you can't hear my rumbly stomach there. Good gracious. All righty, boy, gonna have a little sip of water, then we'll get into the next chapter there. Man. See, Darnay. Okay. Alrighty. Boom. Okay. Oh boy. Sorry, I was just taking a quick little peek at the Wikipedia there, just to make sure that I'm not misunderstanding anything. Alrighty. Let me just quickly post the link there for anyone who needs it.
think everyone's got it by now, but just in case. There it is. Boom. Bleep. There we go. Okay. Man, there's a lot of people in this story. A lot of people. All right, so who'd like to be living in 1700s France right now? Not me. Good gracious. Would be terrible. Terrible. That's okay, though. Yeah, I mean, aside from even if things were good, I mean, even just basic things like plumbing, running water, stuff like that. It would be rough. It would be quite rough, without all those modern conveniences. That's for sure. I would think. Okay. Indoor plumbing is a must. Yeah. I mean that's fairly new. Fairly new. In the greater scheme of things, very, very new. Okay. Let's get back to our book. Where is it? Here it is. Chapter 18. 9 days. The marriage day was shining brightly, and they were ready outside the closed door of the doctor's room, where he was speaking with Charles Darnay. They were ready to go to church. The beautiful bride, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross, to whom the event, through a gradual process of reconcilement to the inevitable, would have been one of absolute bliss, but for the yet lingering consideration that her brother Solomon should have been the bridegroom. "And so," said Mr. Lorry, who could not sufficiently admire the bride, and who had been moving round her to take in every point of her quiet, pretty dress, "and so it was for this, my sweet Lucie, that I brought you across the Channel, such a baby. Lord bless me, how little I thought what I was doing, how lightly I valued the obligation I was conferring on my friend Mr. Charles." "Oh, you didn't mean it," remarked the matter-of-fact Miss Pross, "and therefore how could you know it? Nonsense." "Really? Well, don't cry," said the gentle Mr. Lorry. "I'm not crying," said Miss Pross. "You are." "I, my Pross?" By this time Mr. Lorry dared to be pleasant with her on occasion. "You were just now. I saw you do it, and I don't wonder at it. Such a present of plate as you have made him is enough to bring tears into anybody's eyes. There's not a fork or a spoon in the collection," said Miss Pross, "that I don't cry over, last night after the box came, till I couldn't see it." "I'm highly gratified," said Mr. Lorry, "though upon my honour I had no intention of rendering those trifling articles of remembrance invisible to anyone. Oh, dear me, this is an occasion that makes a man speculate on all that he has lost. Dear, 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 to think that there might have been a Mrs. Lorry any time these 50 years almost." "Not at all," from Miss Pross. "You think there might never have been a Mrs. Lorry?" asked the gentleman of that name. "Pooh," rejoined Miss Pross, "you were a bachelor in your cradle." "Well," observed Mr. Lorry, beamingly adjusting his little wig, "that seems probable, too." "And you were cut out for a bachelor," pursued Miss Pross, "before you were put in your cradle." "Then I think," said Mr. Lorry, "that I was very unhandsomely dealt with, and that I ought to have had a voice in the selection of my pattern. Enough. Now, my dear Lucie," drawing his arms soothingly round her waist, "I hear them moving in the next room, and Miss Pross and I, as two formal folks of business, are anxious not to lose the final opportunity of saying something to you that you wish to hear. You leave your good father, my dear, in hands as earnest and as loving as your own. He shall be taken every conceivable care of,
during the next fortnight, while you are in Warwickshire and thereabouts, even Tellson's shall go to the wall, comparatively speaking, before him. And when, at the fortnight's end, he comes to join you and your beloved husband on your other fortnight's trip in Wales, you shall say that we have sent him to you in the best health and in the happiest frame. Now I hear somebody's step coming to the door. Let me kiss my dear girl with an old-fashioned bachelor blessing before somebody comes to claim his own." For a moment he held the fair face from him to look at the well-remembered expression on the forehead, and then laid the bright golden hair against his little brown wig with a genuine tenderness and delicacy, which, if such things be old-fashioned, were as old as Adam. The door of the doctor's room opened, and he came out with Charles Darnay. He was so deadly pale, which had not been the case when they went in together, that no vestige of colour was to be seen in his face. But in the composure of his manner he was unaltered, except that to the shrewd glance of Mr. Lorry it disclosed some shadowy indication that the old air of avoidance and dread had lately passed over him, like a cold wind. He gave his arm to his daughter, and took her downstairs to the chariot which Mr. Lorry had hired in honour of the day. The rest followed in another carriage, and soon in a neighbouring church, where no strange eyes looked on, Charles Darnay and Lucie Manette were happily married. Besides the glancing tears that shone among the smiles of the little group when it was done, some diamonds, very bright and sparkling, glanced on the bride's hand, which were newly released from the dark obscurity of one of Mr. Lorry's pockets. They returned home to breakfast, and all went well, and in due course the golden hair that had mingled with the poor shoemaker's white locks in the Paris garret were mingled with them again in the morning sunlight on the threshold of the door at parting. It was a hard parting, though it was not for long. But her father cheered her, and said at last, gently disengaging himself from her enfolding arms, "Take her, Charles. She is yours." And her agitated hand waved to them from a chaise window, and she was gone. The corner being out of the way of the idle and curious, and the preparations having been very simple and few, the doctor, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross were left quite alone. It was when they turned into the welcome shade of the cool old hall that Mr. Lorry observed a great change to have come over the doctor, as if the golden arm uplifted there had struck him a poisoned blow. He had naturally repressed much, and some revulsion might have been expected in him when the occasion for repression was gone. But it was the old scared, lost look that troubled Mr. Lorry, and through his absent manner of clasping his head and drearily wandering away into his own room when they got upstairs, Mr. Lorry was reminded of Defarge, the wine-shop keeper, and the starlight ride. "I think," he whispered to Miss Pross, after anxious consideration, "I think we had best not speak to him just now, or at all disturb him. I must look in at Tellson's, so I will go there at once and come back presently. Then we will take him a ride into the country, and dine there, and all will be well." It was easier for Mr. Lorry to look in at Tellson's than to look out of Tellson's. He was detained 2 hours. When he came back, he ascended the old staircase alone, having asked no questions of the servant. Going thus into the doctor's rooms, he was stopped by a low sound of knocking. "Good God!" he said with a start. "What's that?" Miss Pross, with a terrified face, was at his ear. Oh me, all is lost!" cried she, wringing her hands. "What is to be told to Ladybird? He doesn't know me, and is making shoes." Mr. Lorry said what he could do to calm her, and went himself into the doctor's room. The bench was turned towards the light, as it had been when he had seen the shoemaker at his work before, and his head was bent down, and he was very busy. "Dr. Manette, my dear friend, Dr. Manette."
The doctor looked at him for a moment, half inquiringly, half as if he were angry at being spoken to, and bent over his work again. He had laid aside his coat and waistcoat. His shirt was open at the throat, as it used to be when he did that work, and even the old haggard, faded surface of face had come back to him. He worked hard, impatiently, as if some sense of having been interrupted. Mr. Lorry glanced at the work in his hand, and observed that it was a shoe of the old size and shape. He took up another that was lying by him, and asked what it was.
"A young lady's walking shoe," he muttered without looking up. "It ought to have been finished long ago. Let it be."
"But, Dr. Manette, look at me." He obeyed, in the old mechanically submissive manner, without pausing in his work. "You know me, my dear friend. Think again. This is not your proper occupation. Think, dear friend." Nothing would induce him to speak more. He looked up for an instant at a time when he was requested to do so, but no persuasion would extract a word from him. He worked and worked and worked in silence, and words fell on him as they would have fallen on an echoless wall or on the air. The only ray of hope that Mr. Lorry could discover was that he sometimes furtively looked up without being asked. In that there seemed a faint expression of curiosity or perplexity, as though he were trying to reconcile some doubts in his mind. Two things at once impressed themselves on Mr. Lorry, as important above all others. The first, that this must be kept secret from Lucie. The second, that it must be kept secret from all who knew him. In conjunction with Miss Pross, he took immediate steps towards the latter precaution by giving out that the doctor was not well and required a few days of complete rest. In aid of the kind deception to be practiced on his daughter, Miss Pross was to write, describing his having been called away professionally, and referring to an imaginary letter of 2 or 3 hurried lines in his own hand, represented to have been addressed to her by the same post. These measures, advisable to be taken in any case, Mr. Lorry took in the hope of his coming to himself. If that should happen soon, he kept another course in reserve, which was to have a certain opinion that he thought the best on the doctor's case. In the hope of his recovery, and of resort to this third course being thereby rendered practicable, Mr. Lorry resolved to watch him attentively, with as little appearance as possible of doing so. He therefore made arrangements to absent himself from Tellson's for the first time in his life, and took his post by the window in the same room. He was not long in discovering that it was worse than useless to speak to him, since on being pressed he became worried. He abandoned that attempt on the first day, and resolved merely to keep himself always before him, as a silent protest against the delusion into which he had fallen, or was falling. He remained, therefore, in his seat near the window, reading and writing, and expressing in as many pleasant and natural ways as he could think of that it was a free place. Dr. Manette took what was given him to eat and drink, and worked on that first day until it was too dark to see. Worked on half an hour after Mr. Lorry could not have seen for his life to read or write. When he put his tools aside as useless until morning, Mr. Lorry rose and said to him, "Will you go out?" He looked down at the floor on either side of him in the old manner, looked up in the old manner, and repeated in the old low voice, "Out?" "Yes, for a walk with me. Why not?" He made no effort to say why not, and said not a word more. But Mr. Lorry thought he saw, as he leaned forward on his bench in the dusk, with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands, that he was in some misty way asking himself why not. The sagacity of the man of business perceived an advantage here, and determined to hold it.
Miss Pross and he divided the night into 2 watches, and observed him at intervals from the adjoining room. He paced up and down for a long time before he lay down, but when he did finally lay himself down, he fell asleep. In the morning he was up betimes, and went straight to his bench and to work. On the 2nd day, Mr. Lorry saluted him cheerfully by his name, and spoke to him on topics that had been of late familiar to them. He returned no reply, but it was evident that he had heard what was said, and that he thought about it, however confusedly. This encouraged Mr. Lorry to have Miss Pross in with her work several times during the day. At those times they quietly spoke of Lucie and of her father then present, precisely in the usual manner, and as if there were nothing amiss. This was done without any demonstrative accompaniment, not long enough or often enough to harass him, and it lightened Mr. Lorry's friendly heart to believe that he looked up oftener, and that he appeared to be stirred by some perception of inconsistencies surrounding him. When it fell dark again, Mr. Lorry asked him as before, "Dear doctor, will you go out?" As before, he repeated, "Out?" "Yes, for a walk with me. Why not?" This time Mr. Lorry feigned to go out when he could extract no answer from him, and after remaining absent for an hour, returned. In the meanwhile, the doctor had removed to the seat in the window, and had sat there, looking down at the plane tree. But on Mr. Lorry's return, he slipped away to his bench. "Sup there, Anya? Good to see you. Good to see you. Man, things are pretty grim in this book right now. Pretty grim. You got the Dr. Manette. He's regressing back into his almost his catatonic prisoner state there, doing his shoemaking compulsively. You got the underground rebellion over in France. The local chapter being led by the Defarge, the winemakers. The Defarge family. They've had spies visiting them. Man. Oh, and Lucie and Charles Darnay just got married. That's a quick little recap. Let's continue. The time went very slowly on, and Mr. Lorry's hope darkened, and his heart grew heavier again, and grew yet heavier and heavier every day. The 3rd day came and went, the 4th, the 5th, 5, 6, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days. With a hope ever darkening, and with a heart always growing heavier and heavier, Mr. Lorry passed through this anxious time. The secret was well kept, and Lucie was unconscious and happy. But he could not fail to observe that the shoemaker, whose hand had been a little out at first, was growing dreadfully skilful, and that he had never been so intent on his work, and that his hands had never been so nimble and expert as in the dusk of the 9th evening. Man, that's not good. Oh, yeah, the other thing too. Yeah, so the spy. Who's sniffing around the winemakers over in France. Everyone's he dropped the info that he knows that Charles Darnay, who's about to marry Lucie, he knows that Charles Darnay is the nephew of the Marquis, of the evil Marquis who got murdered. Which means technically, even though Charles Darnay has changed his name and left France behind, technically he's still French nobility, which is going to be that's going to be bad. He's like, yeah, he'd better not show up here in France. I don't know why the spy is. Here's what I don't understand. Yeah, I don't know why the spy is dropping these kinds of infos to
to the Defarge winemakers. Well, I mean, I guess he's trying to infiltrate them, so maybe he's trying to, I don't know, maybe he's dropping things which he suspects they know, but they don't. Well, I don't think they know Charles Darnay, right? Okay. Okay, a little sip of water, we'll get on with the next chapter. Good Lord, motoring through these. Oh, boy, just looking at the bottom, we are 53% of the way through. Man, this is a big book. This is a big book. Okay, let's do it. Chapter 19, An Opinion. Worn out by anxious watching, Mr. Lorry fell asleep at his post. On the 10th morning of his suspense, he was startled by the shining of the sun into the room where a heavy slumber had overtaken him when it was dark night. It is very, very, boy, it's fascinating, actually. He rubbed his eyes and roused himself, but he doubted, when he had done so, whether he was not still asleep. For, going to the door of the doctor's room and looking in, he perceived that the shoemaker's bench and tools were put aside again, and that the doctor himself sat reading at the window. He was in his usual morning dress, and his face, which Mr. Lorry could distinctly see, though still very pale, was calmly studious and attentive. Even when he had satisfied himself that he was awake, Mr. Lorry felt giddily uncertain for some few moments whether the late shoemaking might not be a disturbed dream of his own, for did not his eyes show him his friend before him, in his accustomed clothing and aspect, and employed as usual? And was there any sign within their range that the change of what he had so strong an impression had actually happened? It was but the inquiry of his first confusion and astonishment, the answer being obvious. If the impression were not produced by a real corresponding and sufficient cause, how came he, Jarvis Lorry, there? How came he to have fallen asleep in his clothes on the sofa in Dr. Manette's consulting room, and to be debating these points outside the doctor's bedroom door in the early morning? Within a few minutes, Miss Pross stood whispering at his side. If he had had any particle of doubt left, her talk would of necessity have resolved it, but he was by that time clear-headed, and had none. He advised that they should let the time go by until the regular breakfast hour, and should then meet the doctor as if nothing unusual had occurred. If he appeared to be in his customary state of mind, Mr. Lorry would then cautiously proceed to seek direction and guidance from the opinion he had been, in his anxiety, so anxious to obtain. Miss Pross submitting herself to his judgment, the scheme was worked out with care. Having abundance of time for his usual methodical toilet, Mr. Lorry presented himself at the breakfast hour in his usual white linen and with his usual neat leg. What does that mean? And with his usual neat leg. I guess. Okay. They're not. Okay. I guess. Normal composure. I think that's supposed to mean composure. I'm just. So it's like, what? He's got one leg. His usual leg. Right. Okay. The doctor was, I think it means, in his usual way of walking, I think is they're supposed to, yeah. The doctor was summoned in the usual way, and came to breakfast. So far as it was possible to comprehend him, without overstepping those delicate and gradual approaches which Mr. Lorry felt to be the only safe advance, he at first supposed that his daughter's marriage had taken place yesterday. An incidental allusion, purposely thrown out, to the day of the week and the day of the month, set him thinking and counting, and evidently made him uneasy. In all other respects, however, he was so composedly himself that Mr. Lorry determined to have the aid he sought, and that aid was his own. Therefore, when the breakfast was done and cleared away, and he and the doctor were left together, Mr. Lorry said feelingly, "My dear Manette, I'm anxious to have your opinion, in confidence, on a very curious case in which I'm deeply interested. That is to say, it is very curious to me. Perhaps to your better information it may be less so." Glancing at his hands, which were discoloured by his late work, the doctor looked troubled and listened attentively. He had already glanced at his hands more than once. "Dr. Manette," said Mr. Lorry, touching him affectionately on the arm, "the case is the case of a particularly dear friend of mine. Pray give your mind to it, and advise me well for his sake, and above all for his daughter's sake. His daughter's, my dear Manette." "If I understand," said the doctor in a subdued tone, "some mental shock." "Yes." "Be explicit," said the doctor. "Spare no detail." Mr. Lorry saw that they understood one another, and proceeded. "My dear Manette, it is the case of an old and a prolonged shock, of great acuteness and severity to the affections, the feelings, as you express it, the mind. The mind. It is the case of a shock under which the sufferer was borne down, one cannot say for how long, because I believe he cannot calculate the time himself, and there are no other means of getting at it. It is the case of a shock from which the sufferer recovered by a process that he cannot trace himself, as I once heard him publicly relate in a striking manner. It is the case of a shock from which he has recovered, so completely as to be a highly intelligent man, capable of close application of mind and great exertion of body, and of constantly making fresh additions to his stock of knowledge, which was already very large. But unfortunately there has been—" He paused and took a deep breath. "A slight relapse?" The doctor, in a low voice, asked. "Of how long duration?" 9 days and nights. "How did it show itself?" "I infer," glancing at his hands again, "in the resumption of some old pursuit connected with the shock." "That is the fact." "Now, did you ever see him?" asked the doctor, distinctly and collectedly, though in the same low voice, "engaged in that pursuit originally?" "Once." "And when the relapse fell on him, was he in most respects, or in all respects, as he was then?" "I think in all respects." "You spoke of his daughter. Does his daughter know of the relapse?" "No. It has been kept from her, and I hope will always be kept from her. It is known only to myself and to one other who may be trusted." The doctor grasped his hand and murmured, "That was very kind. That was very thoughtful." Mr. Lorry grasped his hand in return, and neither of the two spoke for a little while. "Now, my dear Manette," said Mr. Lorry at length, in his most considerate and most affectionate way, "I am a mere man of business, and unfit to cope with such intricate and difficult matters. I do not possess the kind of information necessary. I do not possess the kind of intelligence. I want guiding. There is no man in this world on whom I could so rely for right guidance as on you. Tell me, how does this relapse come about? Is there danger of another? Could a repetition of it be prevented? How should a repetition of it be treated? How does it come about at all? What can I do for my friend? No man ever can have been more desirous in his heart to serve a friend than I am to serve mine, if I knew how. But I don't know how to originate in such a case. If your sagacity, knowledge, and experience could put me on the right track, I might be able to do so much. Unenlightened and undirected, I can do so little. Pray discuss it with me. Pray enable me to see it a little more clearly, and teach me how to be a little more useful." Dr. Manette sat meditating after these earnest words were spoken, and Mr. Lorry did not press him. "I think it probable," said the doctor, breaking silence with an effort, "that the relapse you have described, my dear friend, was not quite unforeseen by its subject." "Was it dreaded by him?" Mr. Lorry ventured to ask. "Very much." He said it with an involuntary shudder. "You have no idea how such an apprehension weighs on the sufferer's mind, and how difficult, how almost impossible it is for him to force himself to utter a word upon the topic that oppresses him." "Would he," asked Mr. Lorry, "be sensibly relieved if he could prevail upon himself to impart that secret brooding to any one when it is on him?" "I think so, but it is, as I have told you, next to impossible. I even believe it, in some cases, to be quite impossible." "Now," said Mr. Lorry, gently laying his hand on the doctor's arm again, after a short silence on both sides, "to what would you refer this attack?" "I believe," returned Dr. Manette, "that there had been a strong and extraordinary revival of the train of thought and remembrance that was the first cause of the malady. Some intense associations of a most distressing nature were vividly recalled, I think. It is probable that there has been it is possible that there had long been a dread lurking in his mind that those associations would be recalled, say, under certain circumstances, say, on a particular occasion. He tried to prepare himself in vain. Perhaps the effort to prepare himself made him less able to bear it." "Would he be able to remember what took place in the relapse?" asked Mr. Lorry with natural hesitation. The doctor looked desolately round the room, shook his head, and answered in a low voice, No, not at all." "Now, as to the future," hinted Mr. Lorry. "As to the future," said the doctor, recovering firmness, "I should have great hope. As it pleased Heaven in its mercy to restore him so soon, I should have great hope. He yielding under the pressure of a complicated something, long dreaded and long vaguely foreseen and contended against, and recovering after the cloud had burst and passed, I should hope that the worst was over." Well, that's good comfort. I'm thankful," said Mr. Lorry. "I am thankful," repeated the doctor, bending his head with reverence. "There are two other points," said Mr. Lorry, "on which I am anxious to be instructed. I may go on?" "You cannot do your friend a better service." The doctor gave him his hand. To the first, then. He's of a studious habit and unusually energetic. He applies himself with great ardor to the acquisition of professional knowledge, to the conducting of experiments, to many things. Now, does he do too much? I think not.
It may be the character of his mind to be always in singular need of occupation. That may be in part natural to it, in part the result of affliction. The less it was occupied with healthy things, the more it would be in danger of turning in the unhealthy direction. He may have observed himself and made the discovery.
You are sure that he's not under too great a strain?
I think I'm quite sure of it.
My dear Manette, if he were overworked now—
My dear Laurie, I doubt if that could easily be. There has been a violent stress in one direction, and it needs a counterweight.
Excuse me, as a persistent man of business, assuming for a moment that he was overworked, it would show itself in some renewal of this disorder?
I do not think so. I do not think, said Dr. Manette with the firmness of self-conviction, that anything but the one train of association would renew it. I think that henceforth nothing but some extraordinary jarring of that chord could renew it. After what has happened, and after his recovery, I find it difficult to imagine any such violent sounding of that string again. I trust, and I almost believe, that the circumstances likely to renew it are exhausted.
He spoke with the diffidence of a man who knew how slight a thing would overset the delicate organization of the mind, and yet with the confidence of a man who had slowly won his assurance out of personal endurance and distress. It was not for his friend to abate that confidence. He professed himself more relieved and encouraged than he really was, and approached his second and last point. He felt it to be the most difficult of all, but remembering his old Sunday morning conversation with Miss Pross, and remembering what he had seen in the last 9 days, he knew that he must face it. The occupation resumed under the influence of this passing affliction, so happily recovered from, said Mr. Lorry, clearing his throat, we will call blacksmith's work. We will say, to put a case, and for the sake of illustration, that he had been used, in his bad time, to work at a little forge. We will say that when he unexpectedly was found at his forge again. No, we will say that he was unexpectedly found at his forge again. Is it not a pity that he should keep it by him? The doctor shaded his forehead with his hand and beat his foot nervously on the ground. He has always kept it by him, said Mr. Lorry, with an anxious look at his friend. Now, would it not be better that he should let it go? Still the doctor, with shaded forehead, beat his foot nervously on the ground. You do not find it easy to advise me, said Mr. Lorry. I quite understand it to be a nice question, and yet I think— and there he shook his head and stopped. You see, said Dr. Manette, turning to him after an uneasy pause, it is very hard to explain, consistently, the innermost workings of this poor man's mind. He once yearned so frightfully for that occupation, and it was so welcome when it came. No doubt it relieved his pain so much by substituting the perplexity of the fingers for the perplexity of the brain, and by substituting, as he became more practiced, the ingenuity of the hands for the ingenuity of the mental torture, that he has never been able to bear the thought of putting it quite out of his reach. Even now, when I believe he is more hopeful of himself than he has ever been, and even speaks of himself with a kind of confidence, the idea that he might need that old employment and not find it gives him a sudden sense of terror, like that which one may fancy strikes to the heart of a lost child.
He looked like his illustration as he raised his eyes to Mr. Lorry's face. "But may not... No. May not, mind. I ask for information, as a plodding man of business who only deals with such material objects as guineas, shillings, and banknotes. May not the retention of the thing involve the retention of the idea? If the thing were gone, my dear Manette, might not the fear go with it? In short, is it not a concession to the misgiving to keep the forge?" There was another silence. "You see, too," said the doctor tremulously, "it is such an old companion." "I would not keep it," said Mr. Lorry, shaking his head, for he gained in firmness as he saw the doctor disquieted. "I would recommend him to sacrifice it. I only want your authority. I'm sure it does no good. Come, give me your authority, like a dear good man. For his daughter's sake, my dear Manette." Very strange to see what a struggle there was within him. "In her name, then, let it be done. I sanction it. But I would not take it away while he was present. Let it be removed when he's not there. Let him miss the old companion after an absence." Mr. Lorry readily engaged for that, and the conference was ended. They passed the day in the country, and the doctor was quite restored. On the 3 following days he remained perfectly well, and on the 14th day he went away to join Lucie and her husband. The precaution that had been taken to account for his silence, Mr. Lorry had previously explained to him, and he had written to Lucie in accordance with it, and she had no suspicions. On the night of the day on which he left the house, Mr. Lorry went into his room with a chopper, saw, chisel, and hammer, attended by Miss Pross carrying a light. There, with closed doors, and in a mysterious and guilty manner, Mr. Lorry hacked the shoemaker's bench to pieces, while Miss Pross held the candle as if she were assisting at a murder, for which, indeed, in her grimness, she was no unsuitable figure. The burning of the body, previously reduced to pieces convenient for the purpose, was commenced without delay in the kitchen fire, and the tools, shoes, and leather were buried in the garden. So wicked do destruction and secrecy appear to honest minds, that Mr. Lorry and Mr. Pross, while engaged in the commission of their deed and in the removal of its traces, almost felt and almost looked like accomplices in a horrible crime. Man. Okay, so that was unexpected. I'm just going to do a quick page count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Yeah, okay, yeah, we got time for another chapter. We've got time for one more chapter. Oh boy. There we go. Okay, don't forget, just want to remind people, there's no book club tomorrow. Not tomorrow morning. Normally would do one Thursday morning. But I'm going to be a little tied up in the morning tomorrow, so not tomorrow. But we got a bonus gaming stream tonight. A bonus one tonight, because I don't normally do that on a Wednesday. Okay. Let's do it. Chapter 20. A plea. When the newly married pair came home, the first person who appeared to offer his congratulations was Sidney Carton. They had not been at home many hours when he presented himself. He was not improved in habits, or in looks, or in manner, but there was a certain rugged air of fidelity about him, which was new to the observation of Charles Darnay. He watched his opportunity of taking Darnay aside into a window, and of speaking to him when no one overheard.
"Mr. Darnay," said Carton, "I wish we might be friends."
"We are already friends, I hope."
You're good enough to say so, as a fashion of speech, but I don't mean any fashion of speech. Indeed, when I say I wish we might be friends, I scarcely quite mean that either."
Charles Darnay, as was natural, asked him, in all good humour and good fellowship, what did he mean?
"Upon my life," said Carton, smiling, "I find that easier to comprehend in my own mind than to convey to yours. However, let me try. You remember a certain famous occasion when I was more drunk than usual?"
"Well, I remember a certain famous occasion when you forced me to confess that you had been drinking."
"Yeah, I remember it too. The curse of those occasions is heavy upon me, for I always remember them. I hope it may be taken into account one day, when all days are at an end for me. Don't be alarmed. I'm not going to preach."
"Oh, I'm not at all alarmed. Earnestness in you is anything but alarming to me."
"Ah," said Carton, with a careless wave of his hand, as if he waved that away. "On the drunken occasion in question, one of a large number, as you know, I was insufferable about liking you and not liking you. I wish you would forget it."
"I forgot it a long time ago."
Fashion of speech again. But, Mr. Darnay, oblivion is not so easy to me as you represent it to be to you. I have no means forgotten it, and a light answer does not help me to forget it."
"If it was a light answer," returned Darnay, "I beg your forgiveness for it. I had no other object than to turn a slight thing, which, to my surprise, seems to trouble you too much, aside. I declare to you, on the faith of a gentleman, that I have long dismissed it from my mind. Good heaven, what was there to dismiss? Have I had nothing more important to remember in the great service you rendered me that day?"
"As to the great service," said Carton, "I am bound to avow to you, when you speak of it in that way, that it was mere professional claptrap. I don't know that I cared what became of you when I rendered it. Mind, I say when I rendered it. I'm speaking of the past."
"You make light of the obligation," returned Darnay, "but I will not quarrel with your light answer."
"Genuine truth, Mr. Darnay, trust me. I've gone aside from my purpose. I was speaking about our being friends. Now, you know me. You know I'm incapable of all the higher and better flights of men. If you doubt it, ask Stryver. He'll tell you."
I prefer to form my own opinion without the aid of his."
"Well, at any rate, you know me as a dissolute dog who's never done any good and never will."
"Well, I don't know that you never will."
"But I do, and you must take my word for it. Well, if you could endure to have a worthless fellow, and a fellow of such indifferent reputation, coming and going at odd times, I should ask that I might be permitted to come and go as a privileged person here, that I might be regarded as a useless, I would add, if it were not for the resemblance I detected between you and me, an unornamental piece of furniture, tolerated for its old service and taken no notice of. I doubt if I should abuse the permission. It's 100 to 1 if I should avail myself of it 4 times in a year. It would satisfy me, I dare say, to know that I had it."
"Will you try?"
"That's another way of saying that I'm placed on the footing I've indicated. I thank you, Darnay. I may use that freedom with your name?"
I think so, Carton, by this time." They shook hands upon it, and Sidney turned away. Within a minute afterwards he was to all outward appearance as unsubstantial as ever. When he was gone, and in the course of an evening passed with Miss Pross, the doctor and Mr. Lorry, Charles Darnay made some... What? When he was gone, and in the course of an evening passed with Miss Pross, the doctor, and Mr. Lorry, Charles Darnay made some mention of this conversation in general terms, and spoke of Sidney Carton as a problem of carelessness and recklessness. He spoke of him, in short, not bitterly or meaning to bear hard upon him, but as anybody might who saw him as he showed himself. He had no idea that this could dwell in the thoughts of his fair young wife, but when he afterwards joined her in their own rooms, he found her waiting for him, with the old pretty lifting of the forehead strongly marked. "We are thoughtful tonight," said Darnay, drawing his arm around her.
"Yes, dearest Charles,"
with her hands on his breast, and the inquiring and attentive expression fixed upon him.
"We are rather thoughtful tonight, for we have something on our mind tonight."
"What is it, my Lucie?"
"Will you promise not to press one question on me if I beg you not to ask it?"
Will I promise? What will I not promise, my love?" What, indeed, with his hand putting aside the golden hair from the cheek, and his other hand against the heart that beat for him.
"I think, Charles, poor Mr. Carton deserves more consideration and respect than you expressed for him tonight."
"Indeed, my own? Why so?"
"That is what you are not to ask me. But I think, I know, he does."
"If you know it, it is enough. What would you have me do, my life?"
"I would ask you, dearest, to be very generous with him always, and very lenient on his faults when he's not by. I would ask you to believe that he has a heart he very, very seldom reveals, and that there are deep wounds in it. My dear, I have seen it bleeding."
"It is a painful reflection to me," said Charles Darnay, quite astounded, "that I should have done him any wrong. I never thought this of him."
"My husband, it is so. I fear he is not to be reclaimed. There is scarcely a hope that anything in his character or fortunes is reparable now, but I am sure that he is capable of good things, gentle things, even magnanimous things."
She looked so beautiful in the purity of her faith in this lost man that her husband could have looked at her as she was for hours.
"And, oh, my dearest love," she urged, clinging nearer to him, laying her head upon his breast, and raising her eyes to his, "remember how strong we are in our happiness, and how weak he is in his misery."
The supplication touched him home. "I will always remember it, dear heart. I will remember it as long as I live." He bent over the golden head and put the rosy lips to his, and folded her in his arms. If one forlorn wanderer, then pacing the dark streets, could have heard her innocent disclosure, and could have seen the drops of pity, kissed away by her husband from the soft blue eyes, so loving of that husband, he might have cried to the night, and the words would not have parted from his lips for the first time, "God bless her for her sweet compassion." Ooh, that was a very short chapter. Very short chapter. Oh, well, we had the big foreshadowing with Mr. Sidney Carton yesterday. But there we go. That's as far as we're going with A Tale of Two Cities today. That's right. That's right. Just a quick little peek here. Yeah. There's only so much reading I can do a day there, Anya. Only so much we can do a day. What is... Don't know. Let's open up our book of Poe here real fast. Okay, so we did, Silent. We read that yesterday or the day before. Yeah. The Fall, the Conversation. What was this? 1, 2, 3. Oh, no. Okay, let's read this thing here. I don't think we've ever read this. The Conversation of Eiros and Charmion by Edgar Allan Poe. Never read this. I will bring fire to thee, said Euripides, and it's all good, Anya. It's all good. Yeah, I know today's a big day. Yeah, actually, I pity the fools. I pity the fools who's out supermarket shopping today. Man. It's like one of the worst days to go grocery shopping. Yeah. Everyone's jamming the supermarkets. Well, I guess, probably today even so. Y'all them fools. All right. Yeah, I get it all. Yeah, I get everything done well before. I hate going to any kind of store around about this time of thing. Got to get it done early. Eiros. Why do you call me Eiros? Says Charmion. So henceforth you will always be called. You must forget, too, my earthly name, and speak to me as Charmion. This is indeed no dream, says Eiros. Says Charmion. Dreams are with us no more, but of these mysteries anon. I rejoice to see you looking lifelike and rational. The film of the shadow has already passed from off your eyes. Be of heart and fear nothing. Your allotted days of stupor have expired, and tomorrow I will myself induct you into the full joys and wonders of your novel existence. Says Eiros. Oh, there's William. There he is. What's up? True, I feel no stupor, none at all. The wild sickness and the terrible darkness have left me, and I hear no longer that mad, rushing, horrible sound, like the voice of many waters. Yet my senses are bewildered, Charmion, with the keenness of their perception of the new. Says Charmion. The few days will remove all this, but I fully understand you and feel for you. It is now 10 earthly years since I underwent what you undergo, yet the remembrance of it hangs by me still. You have now suffered all of pain, however, which you will suffer in Iden. In Iden? In Iden. Oh, God, pity me, Charmion. I am overburdened with the majesty of all things, of the unknown now known, of the speculative future merged into the august and certain present. Grapple not now with such thoughts. Tomorrow we will speak of this. Your mind wavers, and its agitation will find relief in the exercise of simple memories. Look not around, nor forward, but back. I am burning with anxiety to hear the details of that stupendous event which threw you among us. Tell me of it. Let us converse of familiar things in the old familiar language of the world which has so fearfully perished. Most fearfully, fearfully. This is indeed no dream. Dreams are no more. Was I much mourned, my Eiros? Mourned, Charmion? Oh, deeply.
To that last hour of all, there hung a cloud of intense gloom and devout sorrow over your household.
And that last hour, speak of it. Remember that, beyond the naked fact of the catastrophe itself, I know nothing. When, coming out from among mankind, I passed into night through the grave, at that period, if I remember aright, the calamity which overwhelmed you was utterly unanticipated. But indeed, I knew little of the speculative philosophy of the day.
The individual calamity was, as you say, entirely unanticipated, but analogous misfortunes had long been a subject of discussion with astronomers. I need scarce tell you, my friend, that even when you left us, men had agreed to understand those passages in the most holy writings which speak of the final destruction of all things by fire, as having reference to the orb of the earth alone. But in regard to the immediate agency of the ruin, speculation had been at fault from that epoch in astronomical knowledge in which the comets were divested of the terrors of flame. The very moderate density of these bodies had been well established. They had been observed to pass among the satellites of Jupiter without bringing about any sensible alteration either in the masses or in the orbits of these secondary planets. We had long regarded the wanderers as vapory creations of inconceivable tenuity, and as altogether incapable of doing injury to our substantial globe, even in the event of contact. But contact was not in any degree dreaded, for the elements of all the comets were accurately known, that among them we should look for the agency of the threatened fiery destruction had been for many years considered an inadmissible idea, but wonders and wild fancies had been, of late days, strangely rife among mankind, and although it was only with a few of the ignorant that actual apprehension prevailed, upon the announcement by astronomers of a new comet, yet this announcement was generally received with I know not what of agitation and mistrust. The elements of the strange orb were immediately calculated, and it was at once conceded by all observers that its path at perihelion would bring it into very close proximity with the earth. There were 2 or 3 astronomers of secondary note who resolutely maintained that a contact was inevitable. I cannot very well express to you the effect of this intelligence upon the people. For a few short days they would not believe an assertion which their intellect, so long employed among worldly considerations, could not in any manner grasp. But the truth of a vitally important fact soon makes its way into the understanding of even the most stolid. Finally, all men saw that astronomical knowledge lied not, and they awaited the comet. Its approach was not, at first, seemingly rapid, nor was its appearance of very unusual character. It was of a dull red, and had little perceptible train. For 7 or 8 days we saw no material increase in its apparent diameter, and but a partial alteration in its color. Meantime the ordinary affairs of men were discarded, and all interests absorbed in a growing discussion, instituted by the philosophic, in respect to the cometary nature. Even the grossly ignorant aroused their sluggish capacities to such considerations. The learned now gave their intellect, their soul, to no such points as the allaying of fear, or to the sustenance of loved theory. They panted for right views. They groaned for perfected knowledge. Truth arose in the purity of her strength and exceeding majesty, and the wise bowed down and adored. That material injury to our globe, or to its inhabitants, would result from the apprehended contact, was an opinion which hourly lost ground among the wise, and the wise were now freely permitted to rule the reason and the fancy of the crowd. it was demonstrated that the density of the comet's nucleus was far less than that of our rarest gas, and the harmless passage of a similar visitor among the satellites of Jupiter was a point strongly insisted upon, and which served greatly to allay terror. Theologists, with an earnestness fear enkindled, dwelt upon the biblical prophecies, and expounded them to the people with a directness and simplicity of which no previous instance had been known. That the final destruction of the earth must be brought about by the agency of fire was urged with a spirit that enforced everywhere conviction, and that the comets were of no fiery nature, as all men now knew, was a truth which relieved all, in a great measure, from the apprehension of the great calamity foretold. It is noticeable that the popular prejudices and vulgar errors in regard to pestilences and wars, errors which were wont to prevail upon every appearance of a comet, were now altogether unknown. As if by some sudden convulsive exertion, reason had at once hurled superstition from her throne. The feeblest intellect had derived vigor from excessive interest. What minor evils might arise from the contact were points of elaborate question. The learned spoke of slight geological disturbances, of probable alterations in climate, and consequently in vegetation, of possible magnetic and electric influences. Many held that no visible or perceptible effect would in any manner be produced. While such discussions were going on, their subject gradually approached, growing larger in apparent diameter and of a more brilliant lustre. Mankind grew paler as it came. All human operations were suspended. There was an epoch in the course of the general sentiment when the comet had attained, at length, a size surpassing that of any previously recorded visitation. The people now, dismissing any lingering hope that the astronomers were wrong, experienced all the certainty of evil. The chimerical aspect of their terror was gone. The hearts of the stoutest of our race beat violently within their bosoms. A very few days sufficed, however, to merge even such feelings in sentiments more unendurable. We could no longer apply to the strange orb any accustomed thoughts. Its historical attributes had disappeared. It oppressed us with a hideous novelty of emotion. We saw it not as an astronomical phenomenon in the heavens, but as an incubus upon our hearts and a shadow upon our brains. It had taken, with inconceivable rapidity, the character of a gigantic mantle of rare flame, extending from horizon to horizon. Yet a day, and men breathed with greater freedom. It was clear that we were already within the influence of the comet. Yet we lived. We even felt an unusual elasticity of frame and vivacity of mind. The exceeding tenuity of the object of our dread was apparent, for all heavenly objects were plainly visible through it. Meantime our vegetation had perceptibly altered, and we gained faith from this predicted circumstance in the foresight of the wise. A wild luxuriance of foliage, utterly unknown before, burst out upon every vegetable thing. Yet another day, and the evil was not altogether upon us. It was now evident that its nucleus would reach us. A wild change had come over all men, and the first sense of pain was the wild signal for general lamentation and horror. This first scene of pain lay in a rigorous constriction of the breast and lungs, and an insufferable dryness of the skin. It could not be denied that our atmosphere was radically affected. The conformation of this atmosphere and the possible modifications to which it might be subjected were now the topics of discussion. The result of investigation sent an electric thrill of the intensest terror through the universal heart of man. It had been long known that the air which encircled us was a compound of oxygen and nitrogen gases, in the proportion of 21 measures of oxygen and 79 of nitrogen in every 100 of the atmosphere.
Oxygen, which was the principle of combustion and the vehicle of heat, was absolutely necessary to the support of animal life, and was the most powerful and energetic agent in nature. Nitrogen, on the other hand, was incapable of supporting either animal life or flame. An unnatural excess of oxygen would result, it had been ascertained, in just such an elevation of the animal spirits as we had latterly experienced. It was the pursuit, the extension of the idea, which had engendered awe. What would be the result of a total extraction of the nitrogen? A combustion irresistible, all-devouring, omniprevalent, immediate, the entire fulfillment, a combustion irresistible, all-devouring, omniprevalent, immediate, the entire fulfillment in all their minute and terrible details of the fiery and horror-inspiring denunciations of the prophecies of the Holy Book. Why need I paint, Charmion, the now disenchained frenzy of mankind? That tenuity in the comet which had previously inspired us with hope was now the source of the bitterness of despair. In its impalpable, gaseous character, we clearly perceived the consummation of fate. Meantime a day passed again, bearing away with it the last shadow of hope. We gasped in the rapid modification of the air. The red blood bounded tumultuously through its strict channels. A furious delirium possessed all men, and with arms rigidly outstretched toward the threatening heavens, they trembled and shrieked aloud. But the nucleus of the destroyer was now upon us, even here in Iden. I shudder while I speak. Let me be brief. Brief as the ruin that overwhelmed. For a moment there was a wild, lurid light alone, visiting and penetrating all things. Then let us bow down, Charmion, before the excessive majesty of the great God. Then there came a shouting and pervading sound, as if from the mouth itself of him, while the whole incumbent mass of ether in which we existed burst at once into a species of intense flame, for whose surpassing brilliancy and all fervid heat even the angels in the high heaven of pure knowledge have no name. Thus ended all. Okay, did not expect that. Okay. Well, okay, that was kind of funny because we read a story not too long ago by H.G. Wells. I forget the name of it, but it's he had a couple of them there about comets coming in and the end of the world for man and stuff like that. I was totally thinking of those. Obviously, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe, writing much earlier than that. What was this, 1839? So what kind of electricity did they have in 1839? Let me just,